Hey.
One time.
It's 4:20 somewhere, and right now that somewhere is right here. So hello and welcome to the Cannabis Show. My name's producer Vince, and here's your host, Ricardo Baca.
Vince, thank you for that. And to everybody joining us today at the Cannabist Show, welcome. Welcome to the Cannabis Show, where we talk about all things weed.
Hashtag all things weed.
That is the serious cannabis news, as well as the fun stuff that I know a lot of you appreciate as well.
Yeah, we do.
In fact, if you check into the Cannabist right now, you can read stories about a game-changing court decision for medical marijuana patients in Arizona.
It's going down in the AZ.
You can read our first column on commercial cannabis cultivation from a writer who studied horticulture and used to be an organic farmer.
Commercial cannabis cultivation. We are all about that alliteration on the Cannabist.
There you go. And also, these Texas state legislators want to decriminalize pot. But will they be able to in this next legislative session?
We are all on the edges of our seat to find out.
Vince, producer Vince, man, how you doing, man?
You know, Ricardo, I'm doing fairly well. I had a really wonderful, slow, stony Christmas. My lady is 7 months pregnant and too pregnant, in her own words, to travel at this point. So we kicked it up on the couch. We got the Fast and Furious collection, all 7 of them on Blu-ray. And
oh my God.
I smoked some wax, hung out, and found out just how bad all of those movies were in quick succession. How about you, Ricardo?
Wait a minute. Let me get this straight. You watched 7 Fast and Furious movies in a row.
If I'm being totally honest, no. We started with Tokyo Drift, the third one, but that's only because we watched Too Fast, Too Furious fairly regularly in my household, and The Fast and the Furious, we figured we remembered it well enough that we didn't need to go back that far. But they're on the docket to watch soon.
You are an insane person, my man. Props and Merry Christmas belatedly. Things were good at my house. You know, unfortunately, some stomach flu this last weekend. I'm still kind of fending that off. Ugh. And more importantly, I'm mourning the loss, Vince. On Christmas Day, I lost a beautiful 50-foot tall pine tree in my front yard.
I was so sad to see it go, but you've hung out with me enough that there's video now we can show everybody, so let's show the tree while you talk about it.
Oh man, of course. Yeah, here's my beautiful pine tree, R.I.P. tree. If for our viewers in the metro area here around Denver, you know that it was a very windy Christmas. Not a white Christmas, but a windy Christmas.
We got that W in there somehow.
Oh man, and yeah, sure enough, it took that tree down. It destroyed my neighbor's car. It blocked the entire street. It definitely interrupted Christmas for a couple of us, but thank you to the crew that came out to take care of that, the police, to my neighbors. Oh man, madness, Vince, but I'm glad to be back.
I'm glad you survived.
And I think it's time for the Week in Weed, Vince. Are you ready for this Week in Weed?
You know, for 93 episodes now, I've lived my life ready for the Week in Weed, and that's not changing this week, dude. Let's do it. Let's hit it.
And before we jump in, we have some big news to share right after this Week in Weed.
We do, so everybody stick close, stay with us. It's only going to be a couple minutes, and then possibly the biggest news to rock the Cannabist in a while. You'll want to hear it.
All right, we're jumping out to the East Coast in Connecticut to start this Week in Weed, where a groundbreaking health organization is making moves to potentially incorporate cannabis into their end-of-life care for aging senior citizens.
And this goes along with some of the statistics that we've talked about in recent Weeks in Weed and on this show about senior citizens and all those baby boomers really finding ways to medicate with marijuana in 2016.
You know, this is certainly the case at Connecticut Hospice, Inc. in Branford, Connecticut, and believe it or not, that's the nation's first hospice. And officials at that hospice say they want to study cannabis to see how it can help dying patients. In fact, they hope to improve pain management while also reducing opioid use in palliative care.
I'm so happy you didn't give me palliative care to say, dude. But they also hope to decrease nausea and vomiting while improving patients' appetites and overall well-being. Does that sound familiar to y'all?
I know I've improved my well-being somewhat recently, and not today, of course, but yes, it does sound familiar, Vince. This hospice has already secured federal and state approval for the study, which will research cannabis as a painkiller at St. Francis Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut.
And for those of you who are not recognizing it, this is progress. We're seeing it. Just 3 years ago, you couldn't buy marijuana recreationally, and now leading medical facilities for our elders are researching its true potential as a medicine.
Indeed, Vince. I think that's big news. It's really exciting.
I do too, man. Yeah, it's very exciting. It's big. It's huge.
Moving on. Elsewhere in the Week in Weed, medical marijuana is helping more than just humans these days.
Indeed. It's starting to help our cats and dogs and guinea pigs and alpacas and canaries and, you know, whatever freaky freak pet you happen to have at home. And the business is booming.
Yes, the sale of pet products infused with non-psychoactive pot compound CBD, that's cannabidiol, have more than doubled in the last few years, and they might just be on the precipice of even more intense growth.
And perhaps you've heard the names. There's Therabis, Treatables, Austin and Cat, and other CBD pet product lines are thriving, with multiple of them on the verge of signing major deals with big box distributors.
So check this out. America's animal supplements market is already a $500 million industry, and it's expected to grow by even more, another $150 million in the next 4 years. Of course, there's not a lot of CBD research on humans. That's something we've talked about extensively on the show, and as you might imagine, there's even less research on the cannabinoids' impact on our animals.
Yeah, PETA, the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, says they don't support getting animals high, obviously. But, quote, if the proper administration of marijuana can truly relieve dogs' pains, then they should be given the same consideration that humans in pain are given, end quote.
There you go. And finally, to end this Week in Weed, here is our colleague Alisha Wallace with this week's Quick Hit.
In a time of year ripe for reflection, we're looking back on Colorado's 3 years of legal adult-use marijuana sales and making sense of the dollars and cents that came with the first-of-its-kind program. The Colorado Legislative Council recently mapped out revenue projections for the state, including contributions from marijuana taxes. By 2019, Colorado's billion-dollar burgeoning industry could bring about $1.7 billion in sales. But what's in a number? We delve into these past and present projections made for Colorado and elsewhere to see how the actual returns stacked up. We also chat up some economists about the implications of potentially bad forecasts in Nevada, Canada, and elsewhere. These experts note that overestimates could ultimately stifle a new market. In Colorado's early days, there were some, quote-unquote, silly mistakes in calculating something completely new. However, even with what we've learned in Colorado, it's likely to remain a problem for newly legalized markets. Economist Miles Light says that, quote, these mistakes keep happening even today. Economist Miles Light said that, quote, these mistakes keep happening even today. Get up to date with the latest numbers and check out our full report on thecannabist.co. For The Cannabist, I'm Alisha Wallace with this week's Quick Hit.
All right, thanks, Alisha. And I'm back. Normally the Week in Weed gets rid of me, but I'm still here and I'm staying. This week, Ricardo and I are going to sit down one-on-one with y'all, and we're going to have a little bit of chat. So let's just get into it. We wanted to pull back the curtain to kind of have a visual bridge for it.
Breaking the fourth wall. Very exciting, and the reason why we are breaking the fourth wall is because we have some news to share.
Like we promised.
And it's my news to share, so I will just put it out there. After 15 years at the Denver Post and 3 years here at the Cannabist, I am leaving, which is crazy and exciting, and you know, wow, so much news to share. You might have questions. I know Vince certainly has questions.
I had dozens the day he told me, and so I had the idea. I was like, well, why don't we sit down on the Cannabis Show, and I'll ask you all the questions I've wanted to ask you for 3 years, and talk to the Cannabis staff and our online producer, Alisha Wallace, and our critics, and our GMs, and the Denver Post's editorial staff, and everybody, and just said, what should I ask this guy? And we have them for you, everybody.
So thank you for joining us on this special, bittersweet, but also exciting episode of the Cannabist Show. And before I pass things on to Vince, I do want to say that regardless of this news of my departure, the Cannabist is moving forward. And I expect very, very good things from this show, this website, this staff in the years to come. But Vince, it's your show.
It is. Well, it's not my show. I'm still producer Vince, just the happy little sidekick, and the show will also continue after Ricardo's departure. I can't wait to see who we replace him with. But the first question everybody had is, where are you going? How much are you going to tell us about where you're headed?
You know, there's not a lot I can say now, but I can say that I'm joining a startup that is in stealth mode, and it's very exciting. And ultimately, when the opportunity presented itself, I just had to listen, because here I am. I've been at this newspaper for 15 years. I created this site more than 3 years ago, and I'm incredibly proud of the many things I've been able to do in that time. But also in that time, I've been writing and honing the craft of journalism, and it's very important. But as we all know, journalism is under attack from all fronts, and I had the opportunity to pick up an entirely new skill set. And turning 40 years old in a couple months, I was like, hey.
So this is just a midlife crisis, really, more than anything, is what
I plan on living to 100, dude. That midlife crisis isn't coming for another decade or so.
Fair enough. So your startup, will you say, is it another publication? Are people going to be able to read marijuana news from you somewhere else in a few weeks, few months? What's happening with that?
It's not media.
Okay.
I won't be writing much for this publication. It is a very new skill set that I'll be developing, but I will be writing still. I'll continue to be present in some form or another here at the Cannabist, but I'll also be writing for other publications. Very much look forward to continue cannabis journalism. It's something that's so important to me, and even though this new full-time job that I'll be taking on in the new year will have many responsibilities that will keep me busy, I still hope to write 3 or 4 times a month for various outlets, and just make sure that this is something that's very important to me, and continuing to document this process is just necessary. So it's something that I don't want to leave.
Stick around in an advisory role, what would that actually mean?
We're talking about that right now. Me and my colleagues here at the Cannabist, as well as at the Denver Post, are just trying to figure out what this could look like. My continued involvement, I very much want to just ensure that the Cannabist is on the right track to grow. We mentioned it during last week's show, that we set a record in November. More than 1.2 million unique visitors came to us, trusted us for that news that they were seeking, much of which was election news. But let's be real, a lot of it was post-election news, because the election was in the first 8 days of the month, and there was still another 20 plus days. And so that was huge for us to kind of see that people were trusting us. And I just want to make sure that growth trajectory is on point, whether I'm here full time or whether I'm here just in a consulting role.
Excellent. Cool. And so that evolution of cannabis journalism is something that we're going to hit on. And also you mentioned that in last week's episode during the resolutions part. And we're going to talk about that at the end of the show for Ricardo's Weed New Year's resolution. But I have this huge stack of questions here that we should probably get into. And I want to go all the way back to the beginning. I took kind of a deep dive into Ricardo's life after he told me that he was leaving the Cannabist, because I was like, well, who the hell is this guy that I've formed this professional and personal relationship with? And I learned a lot. And I learned a lot about this site that I didn't know about, because I've only been involved for the last 2 years, and I was aware of the Cannabist existing before I landed in Denver, but I was not totally deep into what your original rooted culture of the site was. And so it was fun learning about that. And one of the things that you said about it was that the Denver Post had already been covering medical marijuana and marijuana as a news source and news, and you saw the Cannabist more as a place for a larger cultural conversation to go on, and that was your original intent for the Cannabist. And it's done a lot of hard news in the last 3 years, a lot of soft news, a lot of features. What do you think from that original mission statement of a larger cultural conversation? What have you really turned the Cannabist into?
I think it's always so fun to kind of hold yourself accountable like you're holding me accountable
right now. This is it. Live.
No doubt. I think it just shows how far we've come at the Cannabist, but also in this conversation surrounding legalization and also marijuana journalism. But if you go back to that era, which is actually oddly 3 years ago to this week, you know, because I think it's what, December 27th right now?
Our pot critic Jake Brown had a Facebook status today about 3 years ago. He posted his first thing for the Cannabist, and he was one of your first freelancer hires.
Yeah,
so
that
it's all
was
right. This is it. This is the birthday.
So this is honestly the birthday. But if you go back to previous, the journalism around the subject matter was what it needed to be. Especially in this state, we were covering medical marijuana, which had really found its footing in 2009 after we voted for it in 2000. You know, and we were just reporting on that evolution. But it wasn't really a cultural story because you still needed a license to purchase the drug. And so that was what was unique about it. And when former Denver Post editor Greg Moore first approached me about this with Kevin Dale, his number 2, they were just like, we need to change the way we cover this. We're not exactly sure how we will change it, what that means, but we just need to cover this from a different angle. And so I think when I was talking about, you know, covering it from a cultural perspective, I was referencing, in addition to the news that we're already doing and that we will inevitably continue to do because we are a newspaper, let's throw some fun stuff. You know, and sure enough, it's part of the intro to every show. It's it's the hard news, it's the fun stuff as well. It really is the pot critics, and they're really fun but also intelligent, biting criticism. It's style writer Katie Shapiro, who has brought so much interesting perspective about fashion and style and normalization to the site through her own reporting and her writing. It's, you know, some of the lifestyle pieces that Daniel Jones has been writing, you know, the reasons why you don't want to get high with your parents, or the reasons that you do, and the marijuana life hacks. It really is just incorporating this still newly legal substance, and how we incorporate it into our daily lives. And so that's what was important to me. Let's continue the robust news coverage, and then let's add a cultural component, because this is no longer illegal. This is no longer that substance that has the stigma. Let's treat this like wine, like alcohol, like beer. And that's really what we've tried to do, the good and the bad, warts and all.
And while we're talking about beer and wine and all those things, people openly talk about their alcohol consumption. And when you launched with the Cannabist, you said that it was a big deal to you that you talk honestly about your token or about your consumption habits. And you stopped Stephen Colbert dead in his tracks when he asked you about it on his show, and you said, "I don't smoke, but I do eat it." You really wanted that honesty out there, your personal consumption, your personal history as part of it. Why? And do you regret that 3 years later at all?
No, I've never regretted that for a second. And I don't know why I knew that was important. I think I just, at that time, I was just starting to consume regularly myself. Less than a year before getting this job, I had purchased my first edible. I bought it illegally. A buddy of mine bought it legally. I bought it from him, which means it was an illegal purchase. It was a medical marijuana purchase. And when I had that candy bar, it was 100 milligrams of THC, mint chocolate candy bar. When I had it in my house, it just kind of changed things. And suddenly I realized that I needed to go to the liquor store a lot less. And suddenly I realized that this was absolutely my substance of preference, substance of choice. And that was a game changer to me. And in my conversations that I had with my friends who consumed during that time, and every conversation I had previously when I wasn't using cannabis, I just recognized how intelligent these people were and how they knew before anybody else that, the hype, the misinformation, the propaganda that came out of the Nixon administration and just forged through for decades through the drug war was total BS, right? And so it was important to them that I make my consumption patterns known. And so I just took that to mean that other consumers of cannabis would appreciate reading news from a journalist who he himself was open about his own use. And plus, it's recreationally legal, so fuck that. Why do I care? Putting it out there. At that time, it was a bit nerve-wracking because granted, it was recreationally legal here and in Washington at the time, but nowhere else.
Yeah.
But, I think I just had enough confidence in our ability to do quality work here that hopefully our quality work would outshine the fact that, oh yeah, and the editor consumes cannabis, which inevitably was, you know, all of those people, Colbert, Don Lemon, all the CNN and MSNBC and PBS anchors' first questions. Oh, do you consume cannabis? And it's like, yes, I do. You know, and so many people have thanked us for normalizing cannabis use or legalization, and really that's never been our intention. It's not our job to normalize this stuff or this piece of the puzzle. It's our job to treat it like the other subjects that we treat. And because we treated it with that respect and dedicated multiple people in video and text and photo to tell these stories, that we, you know, normalizing it was just a byproduct. It was never our intention.
I didn't have this worry because I'm a photographer. Photographers are artists. There's already a stoner stigma for my entire field that I was not scared of having that attached to me when I talked about it openly. Did you ever worry about that stoner stigma or the Cannabist collapsing in 2 months and you not being able to, and it following you to your next job, or were you just all in from the beginning?
There was some concern, sure. But I always knew that regardless of me coming on the show or writing on the site about my own consumption patterns and preferences, that, you know, regardless of that, I was going to be doing my best work. The best work that I could possibly put out there. We were going to be treating this subject matter with the respect it deserved, and because of that, I just hope that that would always outshine everything else. And you know, there were certainly moments where, you know, the newspaper industry has taken a hit and continues to take the hits, and you know, there were some scary moments where we were all our colleagues were going through buyouts, and there was a layoff in that time, and certainly what if I was one of those employees who was left without a job, and suddenly people Google my name and it's like, oh, we definitely don't want to hire this guy. But you know, the conversation, I mean, again, this just shows how much has changed in just 3 years.
Oh yeah.
My God, I mean, now it's like, it's gone from, oh, we definitely don't want to hire that guy to, oh, you know, we definitely want to hire that guy, and he smokes weed. And everybody happens to know it because he's talked about it weekly for 3 years. So
93 episodes worth. And so in your personal consumption, we know that you're an edibles guy. You eat your weed, you don't smoke it, and that led to, I mean, because of your consumption habits, it led to the first major, what I think of as the first major investigative story in the Cannabist's history, and that was edibles dosing. Your personal consumption habits led you to a chocolate bar that didn't get you high. And then also people having trust in the Denver Post and calling us with what they thought was a story put you on track with edibles dosing. Would you want to talk about what doing that story meant for you and for the vertical, and what you learned from it and gleaned into?
Yeah, oh, dude, you know, that was fun. And how great, and what a great argument for journalism too, because there was so much feedback, some positive, mostly negative, when I did first talk about, yes, I consume cannabis, but then turn it around in a couple months later, and we're breaking a big national story that went international because I consume cannabis, because my first legal recreational purchase was a chocolate bar made by Dr. J's, and when I ate some that night, I didn't feel it, and I ended up having 3 times my normal dose, which at the time was about 2.5 milligrams, and ended up having 3 or 4 times my normal dose and didn't feel anything. And of course, that turned into a story just a couple months later. So, you know, it just speaks to the importance of journalism and covering these new subjects that might be still taboo, because that meant that we dedicated thousands of dollars of resources, including scientific lab testings, where we took 10 different edible products into the lab, tested each one for potency, and compared those potency amounts to what was printed on the labels, and found that almost none of these companies were getting anywhere near the allotted potency to what they were supposed to be. You know, it's the importance of journalism to be a watchdog, to keep an eye on industry and the regulators, and I think we've done a fairly good job of that in the last couple of years.
I do too. The one question everybody always has for me whenever I talk about that Dr. J's, the edibles dosing testing story, is always why. Why is it important that it's testing below that maximum legal dosage? Why is it important for consumers to know that? Why do you really see that as an important thing to report? What are we really watching out for here? How is that watching out for the safety of the consumer?
Well, you know, any substance, you need a consistency to it. And so if you know how that shot of alcohol or how that beer is going to impact you internally and inside your head, can you drive after it? Can you sleep after it? That's important. And this industry, to attain legitimacy, needs consistency. And so that's why it's important. And especially when you consider some of those Dr. J's products, they had 1/500th of the amount of THC that was supposed to be in there. So if you get that 100 milligram bar, you bite 10, nothing. You eat 10 pieces of 10, supposedly 100 milligrams of activated THC. There's nothing there. You don't feel anything. That's problematic.
Yes.
Then you go eat 100 milligrams of another product, and you are on your ass and still feeling it the next day, potentially. So that's why it's important. Consistency is important, and reliability.
It's become a much more mainstream beat since 3 years ago when you were announced as the first marijuana editor for a major American daily newspaper. Classes are available at universities for it. Papers coast to coast of marijuana writers, beat photographers. They're all starting to cover it. More of the country has access to legal marijuana than doesn't at this point in 2016. I call it the coolest agriculture beat on the planet. That's how I look at it.
Soy's pretty cool.
Soy's rad. Cranberries are cool when you see how those are grown for the first time. I mean, that's true, hydro grow. But what I want to ask you is, what do you see as the future from this space that you're not bowing out of, but definitely stepping out of the spotlight in?
Sure. I see growth and much needed growth. Some of the most important work that's been done in this space has really been done by Christopher Ingram up in Washington Post. We talk about him a lot at the show.
I retweet him at least once a day.
We run almost all of his cannabis journalism on the Cannabist because we subscribe to the Washington Post wire service. He's a data journalist. We need more of that. Alisha Wallace here at the Cannabist, she's covering business and policy on a national level. We need more of that. San Francisco Chronicle just hired my buddy David Downs to be their cannabis editor. Another great American paper, just like the Denver Post, hiring a cannabis editor. And the word on the street is they're creating a vertical similar to the Cannabist.
Let's stick on the Cannabist, please.
So I think there is growth ahead of us, especially when you look ahead at what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a Trump administration, a potential AG Sessions. There is a lot of important news in this space, and it needs to be covered. And not to mention, it's still a birth of an industry, the fastest growing industry in America. And my God, we need to document that. And we also need to hold the regulators accountable to make sure that they're being reasonable and that they're being fair. And we need to hold the businesses accountable to make sure that they're practicing good business that's not putting consumers in danger, that's not ripping consumers off. So I see nothing but growth. And I especially see that in the Cannabist. I know for a fact that the Denver Post is getting ready to infuse cash and resources into the Cannabist, and that's necessary for sustainable, the sustainability of this site. So you will start to see new names here in the Cannabist, and that's necessary. And in fact, we just had a colleague start full-time today. And welcome Polly on board, and we just had another colleague start full-time when next week on the ad sales side. So we're growing. Everybody else is growing. Look what Civilized is doing. High Times is opening a West Coast office. These things are happening. Cannabis journalism is happening, and I hope that we've elevated the conversation, in part bringing legit journalism ethos to this.
Excellent. You've touched on this a little bit, mentioning Chris and Dan out in San Francisco, Chris in Washington and Dan in San Francisco. But I've always kind of wondered it. You were named one of Forbes' most influential people in marijuana. So flex that influence a little. Who do you listen to, though? Who does the most influential man in marijuana look at? Who are the people in the space that you're really admiring right now?
Well, this will seem like a little bit of back padding, but it's honestly not. I was very surprised in 2014 on 420. I got a couple voicemails and a couple social media pings that the Brookings Institute had said that I was one of the most 12 important people in marijuana policy. And of course, not like I was writing policy or even influencing it, but we were covering so much. I was speaking on a national level. I get it. I was very honored, especially coming from Brookings, which is top-notch think tank. But there has been a writer at Brookings who's taken on marijuana as one of his areas of focus. His name is John Hudak, and I think he has really emerged as a star in this space. A smart thinker, a great reporter. I'm very much following his work. I have his book in my bag right now. And so I think he's one of those voices who people should definitely keep an eye on, and I'm thrilled to see his star rise a bit. You know, I think he had a big NPR interview, maybe Fresh Air the other day. Christopher Ingram up at the Washington Post, as well as, you know, I think Jake Brown at the Cannabist is really flexing his own voice. When he came to us, he was a stand-up comic who was just getting his start there, who had an uncanny ability to understand journalism and its tenets and its many complications. I remember when he came to me and he's like, I want to do this, but it might be a conflict of interest because I also have this other thing going on. And the fact that he even recognized that it was a potential conflict of interest told me, wow, this guy understands it. And it's been so great to see him flourish over the last 3 years, to turn into a better critic, but also a commentator. And he's written some great columns in the last couple weeks, but also just the last couple years. And I think he could easily turn into one of those people that we really are looking to understand the legalization space more and more as this entire experiment progresses.
Jake has grown a lot in 3 years. The site's grown a lot in 3 years. It's been a really long 3 years. And so what I want to do is I want to build a roadmap from the first day of legal sales, which were documented in the film Rolling Papers. Everybody can go see Ricardo standing outside in a snowy Denver dispensary line, watching people buy legal recreational weed for the first time in the world ever. It's pretty rad to actually go back and see it. But what I want to look at is from that day to right here when you're saying goodbye to it all, what have been the major turning points in both the cannabis industry, the legalization movement, and cannabis journalism for you?
Oh, that's, you know, I think edibles had to be the big turning point in year one. Mm-hmm. It was really that first snag in this experiment, and especially it was an experiment. I know some people hate that word, but 3 years in, still, if you go back to 2-3 months in, it was an experiment, and we were alone, and Washington was still months away from implementing its system. And so when the trouble with edibles started, that was certainly a big turn in the conversation that is still impacting state legislation here and elsewhere today. Okay. You know, so that was big. I think then you kind of hit this pesticide snag, maybe in 2015. And that was important too, because it was just, all of these things are just reminders that, hey, you should have been paying attention to this when you were writing legislation, when you were determining the rules and the rulemaking. But because this had never been done before in the world, my God, I mean, just think about how crazy / exciting that was. I mean, you and I have had state legislators and state rulemakers on here before, heads of state, you know, the head of the state health department, revenue, all that. And now when they talk about it, it's so casual. They talk about how well it's gone. And I'll tell you about interviewing those same figures early in 2014. It was zipped lips. It was mum's the word. It was like, how can we answer your questions with the least amount of words because we're not sure how this is going to go. And so really they just had no idea how this was going to go. They kept saying, we're learning how to fly the plane as we're building it. It's an apt metaphor. And so when you think about pesticides come along and it's like, oh, shit. Here we are. We haven't really talked about how we're going to regulate the growing of this. They kind of had, but they kind of hadn't. And again, pesticides are regulated federally. This is a federally illegal substance. The EPA is not going to let you do this, verify pesticide chemicals for cannabis. And so it was just complicated. And there was a big turn there. And again, the impact of that turn is being felt now and will be felt next year and will be felt the following year. So I really think of those two as kind of these big two U-turns where the industry, the regulators really had to powwow and say, how are we going to get through this? How are we going to get through this and make sure that everybody is happy with how we're getting through this? And I think so far, at least given what we know, they've handled it pretty responsibly.
So these last few questions are things that I've never been able to talk to you about because you've never been allowed to have an opinion on anything ever before. Vince. It's very true, y'all. Like, this is all a charade. But no, it's just you've always had to answer very honestly and very respectfully. You know, as a journalist, I don't really have an opinion on this, but I do, you know, like, this is the fact. And you've never opined. And I kind of want to use this opportunity to see if you will. There's a good chance he won't, folks, but we'll find out. You've covered pesticides, the finances in the industry from investors to banking, labeling, and a lot more in this beat. We've hit on it a little bit, but what do you really think the one thing that this industry moving forward, what's the biggest issue facing it nationally?
I think, like, if we're talking big picture, which it seems like you are, I think the biggest issue this industry is facing is trust. As we've talked about, there's a lot of, there's decades of misinformation that would make people not trust a legal cannabis industry, a regulated marijuana industry. If you were paying attention throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and most of the aughts, you shouldn't trust weed because it's the devil's lettuce. It's dangerous, and even then, since we've entered into this legal era, some people have misbehaved. Some people have used potentially dangerous chemicals on their plant to save their grow, even though those chemicals could have a very negative health consequence on their end-use consumer. Others have misbehaved by not dosing their products properly. Others have misbehaved in a whole multitude of ways. So whether it's the trust they lost from the misinformation and the campaigns against them, or the trust they've lost from a few bad apples, a few bad characters misbehaving, and even the state regulators admit this is an industry of people who want to work together, toward a common goal of making a successful, legalized, regulated industry. The people who don't behave well are, it's a select few. It's the bad actors. So this is not a lot of people, but because of those few people, the entire industry suffers, and they have to regain this trust. And so I think that's the one thing they need to be concerned about right now. And, that's the one thing they need to be concerned about most.
Absolutely.
They lost a lot of trust. They continue to lose trust. But as people come around to the legalization idea and to the idea, as our governor has, that this can be done responsibly, you can responsibly regulate the sale of legal cannabis to people 21 and older.
Believe it or not.
As they come around to that, they start to trust, and they see these companies behaving well. I just had a friend tell me that when she was buying edibles at the store for a friend who was coming into town, but her friend didn't have an ID, and so she's like, hey, do you mind just grabbing me some edibles before I get there because I don't have my ID, it's expired. And so she did, and she flat out told the bud tender, yeah, this isn't for me, I'm buying it for a friend. And the bud tender's like, I can't sell this to you if this isn't for you. That's industry behaving responsibly. How great is that? The trust is happening, the trust is being developed, and I think that's everything. In fact, you could draw a metaphor between weed and journalism. Fake news throughout this entire year, this election cycle, and before, we have an entire fake news site within the cannabis because there's so much bullshit out there. I really truly believe that we have succeeded at the Cannabist because people trust us. People trust us that we're not going to parrot some BS story out there that the DEA is going to reschedule this, or that Obama is going to sign some miracle thing before the end of his term to legalize it before Trump takes over. That may or may not happen, but we don't know that that's not happening, and so we're not reporting it. So we behave in such a way that they can trust us. If the industry behaves in such a way that customers can trust them, that's going to change everything. If they acknowledge their downfalls, if they acknowledge, past discretions, this is all good news for them as they develop a relationship with the consuming public.
For the last few weeks, we've been asking every guest the same question at the end of every episode. And last week, our pot critic, Jake, turned it around on you, and you were unable to answer honestly, again, as a journalist. He even said, as a journalist, and then no answer. So, since we're saying goodbye to you this week, I thought I'd let Jake re-ask his question.
Oh, yeah, there
Has
you go.
anyone asked you what your resolution is?
Oh, wow. Well, you know, as a journalist, traditional journalist, we're not really making our opinions known all that often. So that's why you guys are here. You guys have all these opinions, and they're valuable and they're valid. And I'm so thankful for you guys sharing them. Me. All right. So I appreciate you turning this back around me. You know, it is such a strange thing when you're a journalist. You know, I don't know if a lot of our listeners, viewers, readers, friends understand, but when you're a journalist, it's unethical to even put a bumper sticker on your car for the candidate you support, a sign in your yard. You can't do that. It's questionably ethical to caucus on behalf of the candidate you support because it's a public event and you may or may not be recognized publicly. And then what would the viewing public say if they saw you caucusing on behalf of X candidate? So, you know, having your opinion out there is a strange thing. And we encountered this at the Cannabist Awards in Vegas a couple months ago. I was looking to advance the Cannabist Awards with a story. And, you know, I just wanted to make editorial work with our business end. They were throwing, we were all throwing a beautiful award ceremony at the Paris Hotel. And I just wanted to write a story in advance that wasn't cheesy, that wasn't like, hey, look at us, here's the second annual Cannabist Awards, rather than like, hey, let's talk about a pertinent issue in this burgeoning industry and in this important industry, this very newsworthy industry. And what I immediately came up with while I was looking at the 41 categories that we had, many nominated businesses and leaders and researchers and authors right there, one of the things I came up with was this idea of giving back and philanthropy. And I ended up penning a piece about 3 businesses that are getting it right. This business gives their 1 for 1. So for every vape pen cartridge Bloom Farms sells in California, they donate a healthy meal to a food bank. The clinic in Colorado throws a massive golf tournament and also does the MS Walk and donates hundreds of thousands of dollars to the National MS Society. And the other business, the Good Chemistry, a Colorado marijuana business, they're just all over the place. They're giving cannabis to patients in need who can't afford it. And they're also donating money to the causes they believe in most, including a lot of money to the HRC, the Human Rights Coalition, and the Ally Awards, and all of these kinds of things. In fact, I'm not sure if it's the HRC. You know, it's one of those very LGBTQ friendly organizations, which is close to Good Kim's heart. And it felt really good to shine the spotlight on people who are doing it right. So the question, what can the marijuana industry do in 2017 to kind of get it right, to get their act together? I would say that they really need to start looking at this idea of corporate responsibility and giving back to the communities that house them. This is an industry that leaves an impact on its neighborhoods. You know, I can smell the grows in my neighborhood. So one of them I can smell from my house sometimes if the wind's blowing a certain direction, and the other, every time I get on the highway, there's the smell. That's considered pollution in this town. Some of us may like it, some of us may not like it. It's pollution. That's how it's defined legally, and you need to make sure that you're hiring locally, that you're giving back locally. There's a business here that, in addition to growing marijuana, they also grow a bunch of vegetables in an outdoor field, and twice a year they set up just a 10-by-10 tent outside the rec center and give away those vegetables. Healthy food to their community. And this is something that hasn't really hit with this new industry for a multitude of reasons. On one hand, you have an industry that's paying exorbitant tax rates. We've talked about 280E. They're paying a lot in taxes because, you know, the very high taxes associated with this, even at state and county and city levels. You know, there's also a very high barrier to entry. You know, these licenses they're not cheap. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at it from this perspective, they are paying a lot just to be able to sell that gram of flower to you, that gram of wax. And so that's a big deal. There's a lot to overcome. But if you are a profitable business, then you should be giving back to your community, and you should be, making a point of making a mark there. And so that's something I think the industry can do to tie this question into another one of your questions. If they do this, then they will rebuild that trust more quickly. The trust that they've lost either justly or unjustly, they can repair that by showing that they are good, active members of their community. And I think that's important. So that's one thing I would encourage the industry to get right, is to really figure out ways to give back. And again, it's not easy to give back because many nonprofits say they can't accept donations from cannabis businesses because it's federally illegal, and these guys are federally regulated as nonprofits, and that's problematic. So let's figure out that, and also as this industry, let's start giving back more and more.
So in 2017, Baca wants ganja to give back. Well, thank you for agreeing to sit with me and hang out and do this kind of exit interviewee weird show for us.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, and then I'll leave everybody with Ricardo and his, he ends the show every week, so this shouldn't be any different.
So every week when we sign off from the show, I am always careful to say that you all, our readers, listeners, viewers, contributors, commenters, and friends, are the most important part of this process. And now that I'm signing off permanently, I'd like to thank everybody one last time. 3 years ago, when my colleague Alita and I were about to flip the switch at the Cannabist, people thought we were pretty crazy, including some folks here in our own newsroom. A news organization entirely about weed? But as we've grown and as others have joined us in the pursuit of legitimate fact-based journalism on marijuana, legalization, and beyond, we've proved the need for such an outlet, which is kind of amazing. We are living through the most substantial drug policy shift in our lifetimes. We are witnessing the end of an unjust and incredibly harmful war on drugs, and we are watching and actively taking part as truth and science overcome decades of fear and misinformation, propelling us into a new golden age of knowledge and information, thank God. As we've always said here on the Cannabist Show, there's still more that we don't know about cannabis than what we do know. So let's hope this historic progress we've been documenting continues, and that research and science continues to tell us how the legalization of this plant will impact our communities for decades and centuries to come. The early research has certainly been encouraging about awareness of stoned driving's dangers, about even or declining teen marijuana use statistics, about legalization's boon to our city and county and state economies and underserved programs. It hasn't been all roses for legal weed, and we've been covering the good and the bad, including more than a year of intense investigative reporting on the state's ongoing battle with pot and pesticides. So, my friends, thank you for tuning in for the conversations. Thanks for reading, especially when our reporting cast a shadow on this still new industry. Thank you for caring about the subject matter and for being a discerning consumer of news and journalism, especially in an era of fake news. Thank you for saying hello at the grocery store or at the cannabis convention. Please still do. I'll still be at both places. And mostly, thanks for putting your trust in me and in us. We've never taken it for granted. Again, while I'm moving on, my colleagues here at the Cannabist are doubling down on this very important work. They are growing, they are investing in a bigger staff, more ways of getting you the content you're passionate about, and they will be here in the coming weeks, months, years to tell you what's real, what's not, in the legalization conversation. So please keep tuning in and keep telling your friends because the Cannabist isn't going anywhere. It's just moving forward. I certainly cannot wait to see where 2017 takes all of us, and I will be there reading and watching the show alongside all of you. So with a special shout out to my colleagues at the Cannabist and the Denver Post, especially Alita Laback, Vince Chandler, Alisha Wallace, Erica Boniface, Polly Washburn, Brad Bogus, and Shang Han. I am Ricardo Baca. I'm Ricardo Baca. It's been an honor and a privilege serving as your marijuana editor, and you can follow along on my next adventure on Twitter at Bruvs, and that's BRUVS. I hope to see you all very, very soon.
I'm allowed to lose, I choose to win, I'm all in, I'm calling any posse you'll be raising at the end. I say it again, ain't afraid to get in, I'll be going for the jackpot with aces in my hem, I'm raw.